in a song of abstractions and temporal uncertainties, understanding the transient partner of confusion. Starlight.
That was a small section of the sixth movement from my set of songs Odysseus, based upon Homer's epic poem, the Odyssey. The music makes it fitting for me to return to the Weimar Castle. Actually, I've no idea whether there was anything here 3,000 years ago at the time of Homer's saga, but there have been many buildings on this site for 1,000 years at least, even if nothing of the original construction remains. Fire and the elements have caused many changes over the years. The current building received a lot of attention in the mid-16th century, when Weimar became the permanent residence of the dukedom. Thereafter, several works by Johann Sebastian Bach were premiered here in the early 18th century. But then the building was destroyed by fire again when the Princess Anna Amalie was resident here in 1774. Duke Karl August requested that the newly appointed Johann Wolfgang Goethe direct the restoration. And it was his vision that guided the new classical interior, especially the staircase and the banqueting hall with sculptures by Christian Friedrich Tieck, which I visited before. The building also went through further changes several decades later, under the directorship of Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna. Now the building houses the Castle Museum, and there are several art pieces I'd like to look at. This is the sacrifice of Iphigenia as oil on canvas, painted by Giovanni Tiepolo. The Italian artist depicted many ancient scenes in a similar Rococo style, including battles and triumph scenes, but he loved the myth of Iphigenia best of all. In fact, he painted the scene of sacrifice repeatedly over a 20-year period. In this depiction, the girl's robe has fallen from her shoulder and her neck is exposed. Achilles, dressed in armour, holds his coke to his face as if shielding himself from view. The priest grasps the sacrificial knife and reaches for the girl's throat. But wait, there's a deer. Artemis has emerged in the background, and there's a replacement for the girl that can be used for the ritual. The goddess can be honoured without the need to slaughter the young girl. What's most remarkable about this version is that it's here at all. After paying for the building renovations, the Duke had very little money left over for buying artwork, yet he was able to find the funds for this piece at least. The Iphigenia myth was just as important to him and Goethe as it had been to Tiepolo. Indeed, given his interest in all things classical, Goethe travelled to Italy for 2 years from 1786. He was particularly intrigued by the classical ideal of art. Painting should tell of historical narratives, in particular those relating to ancient myths. Such an ideal was worth emulating in the modern day because it enabled a true expression of the aesthetic and moral norms to be desired by society. But what are the moral norms of society worth emulating? And if it's possible to identify such norms, how can they be justified? And thereafter, how can the justification be justified? It might seem like a pedantic point, but if I was to take these kinds of issues for granted, then anything I might say about my own ideas about moral norms or the aesthetics of art or of educational policy or the value of music is going to be empty. Having said that, perhaps these things are not so complex. The representation of meaning through the use of language seems intuitive. If somebody says, "The painting represents Iphigenia's simultaneous commitment and distress," then I know what they mean without having to think too much about it. I know they're referring to a fact in the world whereby a painting can refer to an individual's experience of such sentiments. But what is meant by a fact in the world? If it's a fact that, for instance, water is comprised of hydrogen and oxygen atoms, does this mean that the expression "water is H2O" refers to a mind-independent reality, or that it refers to something that exists in the mind that might in turn represent something outside of the mind? Is the fact of a matter the truth of the matter itself, or the truth of the correspondence between the mental idea of the matter and the matter itself? This is, of course, the epistemological question that interested Kant, but I also want to bring it into a new context. I might characterise modern thinking about meaning as divided into two schools of thought. One is the phenomenological, and integrates all levels of mind into a single unit to deal with the significance of meaning to experience. I'll look at this later when I get to Nietzsche and other figures important to the Weimar tradition from around the turn of the 20th century. But for now, I want to look at the two approaches that have tried to explain what meaning is analytically. Firstly, there's the ideas approach, which says that the meaning of linguistic expression is an idea or a concept. It's a descendant of nominalism, as fashioned by Aquinas and Occam, and argues that meaning exists as a mental object in the mind. This seems very reasonable intuitively, as I've said before, but it's an approach that can be problematic. If meaning resides in mental objects that are concepts, and the idea of a concept is itself a mental object, then a concept is defined as being a concept, which, as a tautology, is true but not very helpful. This is Laocoon, the Trojan priest from Greek mythology, who tried to warn the Trojans about the threat of the Trojan horse and his two sons. The original marble is in the Vatican, and this copy was brought here from Italy in 1869. The human figures are wrestling with several huge serpents sent by Apollo, angry at the priest's intervention in Olympian matters that have leapt out from the depths of the sea. They're caught in a fight to the death, and it's a fight they're going to lose. It's a moment of potent sentiment. There's a struggle for survival, and with it, for purpose and meaning. But there's also the despair of faithfulness. These serpents are charmed, and any hope possessed by these human figures, by this father figure, is futile. The Laocoon epitomizes art of the classical world by representing an archetypal moment in narrative, the moment of struggle against contingency, combined with the unavoidability, the necessary condition of tragedy. It's the same sentiment expressed slightly differently of the futility of human freedom in the context of divine authority posited by Luther. My question in this episode pertains to the authority that underpins the notion of a fact in the world, as well as the Kantian transcendental method, and Luther's justification by faith, and the classical ideal, of how it could be a fact that this sculpture represents a struggle. I touched on this issue when I looked at Dawkins' work, but now I want to ask what it is about a fact that implies its authority, and what is the nature of this authority anyhow? The standard answer to this question is that propositional statements gain their authority, their justification, by referring to circumstances existing in an abstract and changeless reality outside of the mind. If water is liquid in English and Wasser ist flüssig in Deutsch are synonymous, it's because both correspond to the same abstract condition that exists outside of language, which is part of something that is external to humans' reference to it. Interestingly, propositional meaning bears certain attributes itself, including the condition of bivalence, whereby expressions are taken as true or false. The proposition water is liquid must, by way of the assertive stance of the statement, be true, otherwise it will be a meaningless expression. It could be true in some literary or figurative sense, while also being false in another, and half true and half false in yet another. But in each of these cases, if it retains its propositional status, it also retains its bivalence. For instance, the expression water might be perceived by fish as a liquid must also be either true or false. Given that propositional meaning is fixed by the abstract external and eternal authority of bivalence, then its terms can be subject to logic, to propositional logic. For instance, using De Morgan's rule, if it's not the case that both Sally and Sandy swam under the bridge today, then either Sally or Sandy did not swim under the bridge today. Indeed, without propositional logic, it will be difficult for language to make any sense at all. But actually, a lot of language isn't intended to make sense, and it's not the limited scope of propositional language I want to consider now. Even if propositional logic structures much of thinking, it still doesn't explain anything about meaning itself. To say that water is liquid and Wasser ist flüssig have the same meaning because they're the same proposition may be a true proposition in itself, but again, it doesn't establish a justification for this truth. It doesn't answer the metaphysical question concerning what or where is this authoritative realm of abstract meaning if it's not in the mind, given mental concepts are usually intended to refer to something outside the mind, and if it's not a physical part of the empirical world, which cannot be justified by the meaning alone. Are we back with Plato and Augustine and another dimension of existence?
This is Tischbein's Hector, based on the siege of Troy from Homer's Iliad. The prince rebukes his brother Paris. They must all take up arms and fight to protect their city. Now is not the time for romancing. But Paris is enamoured with the beautiful Helen. Even if it was his abduction of the girl that started the conflict, he has no appetite for war.
Goethe got to know Tischbein when he was travelling in Italy and saw this recently finished painting in the artist's studio. Like other classical pieces, the form and design are made very clear. There's no ambiguity here. Instead, there is purity and beauty in the moment, and virtue. It's an ethical moment that represents moral norms on how best to live life and how best to communicate with others in dignity and respect. Actually, just with the lacune, Duke Karl August and Goethe were never able to afford this painting. Maybe I shouldn't have selected this as an example of classical Weimar, given it's only been acquired for the Weimar Castle Museum recently. And furthermore, if I'm trying to understand meaning, then perhaps I'm also approaching this in the wrong way. Perhaps if I'm trying to find the truth of meaning, then I should start by thinking about what I mean by truth. I don't mean the truth of whether any particular thing is true, but what the underlying notion of truth means. As I've said, propositional meaning is based on truth by correspondence, at least according to the standard approach. It means there's a necessary connection between something that exists and something that's said about it. If I say it's true that God exists in the spiritual realm, or that leaves have chlorophyll in the natural realm, then I'm saying, in both cases, the fact of God's existence, or the fact that leaves have chlorophyll, is more than a personal subjective belief. I'm saying it's a statement of authoritative truth that God exists, or that leaves have chlorophyll. This approach is not as simple as it sounds because of the fact that many sentences, most sentences, do not correspond to objects in nature. For instance, if I say a negative fact, such as Goethe didn't own this painting, then how can the lack of owning be an object in nature? Or if I say something counterfactual, such as if Duke Karl August had been richer, he might have brought this sculpture to Weimar earlier, how does this possible world scenario correspond to a reality in the actual world? If I can move the sculpture to the other end of the gallery, yet not move the fact that there's a sculpture that can be moved to the other end of the gallery, then I can only conclude that a fact existing in the mind doesn't depend upon correspondence to anything in the world at all. So, if I say the sculpture is powerful, meaning it gives the impression of power, then that is not a propositional authoritative truth at all. It's an aesthetic truth. If I mix the two together and term a powerful structure, comprising of an adjective and a noun, then I have a single entity employing two types of truth. Similarly, if I say that there are two sculptures, then again I have two types of truth, the fact of the structure and the fact that there are two of them, which in turn brings me to the facts of numbers, and the meaning of facts or proofs concerning such things as the infinity of primes and the logic of sets. I must ask if these facts are propositional corresponding to an object in nature, or aesthetic pertaining to a qualitative impression, or something else again.
This is Thorwaldsen's Ganymede and the Eagle. The original, sculpted in marble in 1817, is in the Thorwaldsen Museum in Copenhagen. This one is made of papier-mâché, which made it more affordable to the ducal court.
Ganymede, the most beautiful youth in the world, dressed only in his Phrygian cap, is kneeling to allow the eagle to drink from the bowl. He is guileless, and he doesn't know the truth of what is happening. He doesn't realise that this is Zeus who is metamorphosed into an eagle, and that Zeus adores the young boy. He intends to lure the boy away to Olympus and have him act as retainer, cupbearer of nectar and ambrosia. The meaning or truth of the sculpture is grounded by the myth, which in turn is grounded by the authority of the gods. But there must also be justification of this authority, and then a justification of the authority, on and on. But actually, it would be incoherent to go on and on forever. The human mind could never keep justifying levels of truth indefinitely. And furthermore, if it settled for a never-ending chain, then actually nothing would ever be justified. Similarly, I could say the concepts entailed by the subject-predicate structure of any propositional statement afford authority by way of making an ontological commitment to certain entities which, by way of their existence, give authority in turn to the concepts, which is another circular argument subject to an eternal regress.
So it seems truth must look to a foundational point where the justifications are grounded without needing further justification. Truth must follow the lead of mathematicians who ground their proofs in axioms, such as the shortest distance between 2 points being a straight line, or that parallel lines never cross.
So, what are the foundational axioms of truth? One example is said to be sensory experience. If I say that I saw an eagle, that it's true that I saw an eagle, then I shouldn't have to further justify this. The mere fact that I saw an eagle is sufficient foundations for me to say I believe I saw an eagle. Actually, there may not have been an eagle there, and I may have imagined it, but nevertheless I still saw it. My personal experience is infallible, and so this can be taken as a foundation for knowledge. It may not in itself be a justification of correspondence between knowledge and the reality of the world, but it's a justification of personal knowledge, or belief at least. And after all knowledge must be personalised in the end. I'll come back to this matter in a later episode.
I've come to the Genst staircase, named after its designer. The sculptures of classical figures were created by Christian Friedrich Tieck. It's a magnificent example of neoclassical elegance. The design is based on the monumental entrance of the Acropolis in Athens, the perfect setting for the ducal court to welcome noble guests.
It reminds me that almost all theories of truth from the time of the pre-Socratics incorporated a foundationalist approach to justification and the authority of knowledge. Plato described the roots of knowledge in his theory of forms, while Descartes sought the core justification of knowledge in self-existence. The 18th century dualism between empiricism and rationalism posited that the foundations of knowledge were to be derived from experience and rationalism respectively. But then there came the ontological revolution of the 1960s flower power generation, and a lot of new ideas. One of them, unhappy with the assumptions made by foundationalism and the exemption given to certain would-be self-grounding truths from justifying themselves, such as is the case with personal experience, looked to justify truth not in terms of foundational knowledge, but by way of its coherence within a wider set of beliefs. Coherentism argues that P is true if and only if it coheres with a specified set of propositions. Let me try to explain this. This new paradigm of coherentism acknowledged that justifications must be justified by other justifications. However, rather than positing a linear chain of such justifications that ended with foundationalist truth, it posited that justifications can refer to a coherent web of knowledge. My belief in having seen an eagle is justified by a whole swathe of truths. The look of the bird, the fact that it's in a tree, the fact that I've seen eagles here before, etc. And all of these in turn are justified by a whole network of supporting evidence. It's this web of knowledge that acts to justify both the individual belief and itself as a whole. Eric Olson explained this better than I ever could. Particular beliefs are justified in a secondary or derived sense if they form part of a justified belief system. This is a coherence approach because what makes a belief system justified on this view is its coherence, i.e., the extent to which the member beliefs mutually support or agree with each other, etc. A belief system is justified if it is coherent to a sufficiently high degree. I should add that this web of knowledge doesn't claim to be axiomatic in itself. It's not fixed to anything self-justifying in the manner of foundationalism, like a tent that's pegged to the ground. Instead, continue with the metaphor, it's free-floating. There is no ground. It makes no pretense to correspondence beyond its limited epistemological limits. Nevertheless, it provides justification in virtue of its own systemic coherency. It's a holistic approach to epistemic justification.
I've come to the banquet room again, this time to view Apollino, the adolescent Apollo. The original is in the Medici collection in Italy. It was one of the most frequently copied sculptures all around Europe during the era of German idealism and classical Weimar.
It raises the question of how it might be possible to justify the beauty of the human form. There are many other theoretical approaches to justifying truth that have become popular in the last half-century, besides Coherentism, and one that has become popular among modern idealists is virtue epistemology, which values a reliable cognitive faculty, including reasoning powers, introspection, and memory as intellectual virtues. Virtue epistemology can also be extended to value open-mindedness and intellectual courage, which makes it a strong contender for supporting the kind of discourse learning environment we cultivate at the International School in Weimar. Virtue epistemology attributes authority to knowledge by linking subjective justification with responsible belief. I'll look at transformative learning and habits of mind later, but for now it's enough to say that this approach posits that innate faculties and acquired habits can be sufficient conditions to enable a person to arrive at truth.
But there are yet other theories too, such as the evidentialist approach, which is similar to coherentism. An evidentialist will put the focus of an individual believing a certain idea on the match of the idea to other evidence available to the individual. Beliefs are to be seen as based exclusively on the evidence available at the time, whether or not this matches objective truth. The individual's evidence, or reasoning, is itself sufficient for determining justifications for belief. This approach supports a neo-idealist or doxastic stance, whether it's a mental state that justifies belief rather than any kind of objective correlation.
Then there's a functionalist approach to truth, which seeks justification by way of function, which can be realizable in different ways. The properties that generate truth differ in different fields of knowledge, even if the property of truth itself is a single, higher-order, domain-independent property. Then there's a pragmatist theory of truth, which seeks justification merely by way of community agreement at the end of an inquiry. This approach is important to science methodology. Given that truth propositions are unprovable by definition, then it's only reasonable to compromise and come up with a best fit explanation or hypothesis.
Then there's a deflationary theory of truth, which trivializes the whole notion of truth in the first place. If I say the sculpture is powerful, and then I say it's true the sculpture is powerful, the claim to truth doesn't add anything at all to the substance of the meaning. At most, it's a stance.
Then there's a pluralist or postmodern concept of truth, whereby truth is ethics, and ethics are relative to culture, and all meaning is a cultural construct. I'm planning to look at relativism in a later episode. All of these new approaches make their own metaphysical and ontological assumptions about the nature of knowledge, but none of them, in contrast to foundationalist approaches, rely upon a correspondence between truth and meaning and a mind-independent reality and factuality. Apollino is saying very clearly, at least to my ears, that all of them, in one way or another, recognise the fallibility of knowledge as it pertains to realism, and in this way support an anti-realist stance.
I'd like to finish this episode with the complete sixth movement from my set of songs Odysseus. The hero is sailing home after the victorious Battle of Troy, and he spotted land.
Land ahoy! I see an island. Gulls race to join us. Let us take on fresh water. Beach our ship to the rising tide, for the lotus eaters are kind, and offer the magical food of their flowers. The here's now. We wish the clouds to part. Are these the magnificent crystal pyramids of Atlantis? Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. In a song of abstractions, contemporary uncertainties, understanding the transient partner of confusion. Starlight, starlight. Do we lose our purpose in this intoxication of delight? Escape to a dream of better life, better death. Are we the semi-conscious? The victims of mundanity, the bored, the tired, the empty conformists. How shall we rise from this slumber and shake free the endless undercurrents of desire and frustration? Where is the music of sand smashing rock? Where is the music that will wake us a splash in the face? Where is it buried in our culture? Is it ourselves we bury alive in a pyramid of humanity? 100,000 others crushing us from above, insisting we begin a passage to oblivion.